Hey everyone, welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. This is Dr. Tammy Nemeth, and I'd like to share with you an article I published on my Substack, which you can find in writing at thenemethreport.substack.com. I'm experimenting here with the reading of some of my writing, so please let me know in the comments if this is something you'd like for me to continue or if you think, nah, I'd rather just read it. So please don't forget to like and subscribe and turn on notifications for updates when new content is posted. So, the title of this Substack article is Emissions on the Menu: Behavior Change Through Labels. So, a few weeks ago, I had dinner at a restaurant at a Hilton hotel in London. And although the menu contained the usual trendy British items like a quinoa superfood salad, truffle fries, grilled pork belly, the requisite vegan items, and even a selection of steaks, it also had a color coded letter grade score beside each item. And no, the score wasn't for the calorie count, which was also included, nor was it for the popularity of the item. The letter grade was the CO2 emission score of each dish, calculated by a group called Climato. Not to be confused with the tasty North American vegetable drink Clamato juice. Climato is very serious about its mission to help shift consumer behavior away from meat and dairy products towards meatless alternatives. So the Hilton menu scores each item from A to E, with an A being a nice green, cool, approving color, and C being a warning yellow color, whilst E is an angry, boiling red color. If you're in the mood for a steak, or maybe you'd like some garlic butter on your bread, then you'll be faced with the angry red E. But if you'd like a side of marinated olives or jackfruit croquettes or a chestnut puy lentil cottage pie, then you'll be rewarded with a cheery green A. If you'd like to add some protein to your salad, you better not choose grilled salmon because that'll get you a big fat E. Just add grilled tofu for a respectable B. It almost feels like a school report card, which is probably the point. Perhaps in a few years, the grading system will change to make the E and F. After all, who wants to get a failing grade? There's nothing like going out for dinner and being lectured by a menu. And if you look here, you'll see that on the grill, everything gets an E except for spatchcock poisson and sweet potato fries, which gets a B. Everything else, a sirloin steak, a ribeye steak, garlic prawn skewers, they all get the notorious E rating. Now, to be fair, the labeling of the climate scores on this particular menu were fairly subtle, and I haven't seen the menus from the other hotel chains the Climato site says are clients. And you can see some of them here: Accor Hotels, Voco, Courtyard by Marriott, Fairmont Hotels, Ensmore, and of course Hilton, which is where this particular menu came from. However, there are other labels being tested to see what has a greater impact on shifting consumer behavior. So, enter a group of academics out of Australia. Last week, the online publication The Conversation had a piece from an academic whose team did a study to find out the best way to nudge people into ditching meat and non organic food. Although their study had some flaws, like their choice of meals and snacks to test on American participants were a bit strange, their conclusion was that when the labels were clear and bright and showed, and I quote, the granular differences between and within animal based and plant based options, end quote, and that's the first row below, the subjects of their study tended to choose items that were in the green or the yellow, plant based or low emissions fish or meat, and not in the red, which is beef, lamb, and dairy. Now, perhaps it's notable there were no burgers, no pork, no standard fish dishes in their study. The study concluded with the appeal that their type of labeling ought to be considered by policymakers because their labels identify the source of emissions, and they believe that particular information can sway consumers because, and I quote, social behaviors can be primed by subtle environmental cues. End quote. Now, of course, the last point made by the authors was that there's still a large part of the population who resists so called sustainable consumption. And that's the fancy way of saying non meat or dairy. Therefore, and this is standard for every academic study, they call for more research. That's a shout out for more funding to figure out, and I quote, how to make these consumers engage in sustainable consumption and what interventions would be effective at changing their behaviors, end quote. So back to the menus and other initiatives to change what people eat. Why would hotels, caterers, schools, and restaurants sign on to this kind of scolding social engineering initiative? As climate disclosures and ESG reporting become mandatory in the UK, the EU, Australia, and in the banking sector in Canada, with the accompanying requirement for transition plans, and transition plans must outline how an organization will reduce its emissions over a period of time. Organizations will need to forecast their emissions and plan how they will be reduced over time. The pitch is that having this kind of data will enable organizations to track not only their overall emissions, but also how many low emission meals were served versus high emissions meals, and how those numbers have changed over time. By demonstrating that emission numbers are going down, organizations may be rewarded by their banks, investors, or insurers, as well as provide recipes and emission labels for menus. So, companies like Climato, a Swedish company but with offices in both Sweden and the United Kingdom, offer a software solution to assist food providers in tracking their emissions. They offer a service to restaurants, hotels, and large food providers, including caterers and schools, to calculate the CO2 emission scores of their food supply chain, as well as menu items to help measure, report, and reduce their emissions and, quote, environmental impact, end quote. A few universities in the United Kingdom use Clamato to, and I quote, incorporate sustainability into the dining experience, educating students on the environmental impact of their food choices and promoting eco friendly behaviors, end quote. So, how does Clamato calculate its CO2 emission score? Well, it obtains information from the producer of the ingredients on the growing, transport, processing, refrigeration, and packaging of the ingredients. Then Clamato uses its life cycle assessment methodology to make a calculation. If primary data is unavailable, then Clamato uses, and I quote, the product environmental footprint or PEF methodology to fill gaps and maintain accuracy, end quote. Now, rest assured, their processes and methodology have been approved by the Global Reporting Initiative, the World Wildlife Fund Sweden, and the World Resources Institute. So, why the World Wildlife Fund and World Resources Institute? In 2018, WWF Sweden introduced the One Planet Plate criteria, establishing guidelines for the daily consumption of various types of food in order to maintain the planet's temperature in accordance with the Sustainable Development Goals and various net zero pathways. And I quote, WWF Sweden has developed criteria for meals that adhere to planetary boundaries concerning two aspects of sustainability: climate and biodiversity. End quote. The criteria and the WWF labels have been used by large public institutions in Sweden, such as schools. Given that Climato is a Swedish company, it's unsurprising that it would build on this WWF Sweden initiative and then receive further legitimization from the World Resources Institute. The World Resources Institute has created its Cool Food Meals criteria to help, and I quote, organizations reduce the climate impact of the food they serve by shifting towards more plant rich foods, end quote. You see, they're called cool foods because they help keep the planet from heating. First, it starts with the Cool Food Pledge. Why is there always a pledge? Then micro changes in supply chains, ingredients, and then offering cool food meals as menu items. Key collaborators with WRI's Cool Foods are Sodexo, one of the largest institutional food services companies in the world, and IKEA, its restaurants and grocery stores. In 2019, Sodexo worked with the World Resources Institute to establish targets to reduce its emissions by 34%. In order to align with the Paris Agreement, they also introduced 200 plant based dishes to its global operations. IKEA's strategic topic leader for healthy and sustainable living, wow, that's quite the title, Tanya Dolphin, explained on a cool food promotional video how IKEA is committed to the behavior change agenda. Although IKEA may not have emissions labels on its menu items or in its grocery sections, the reason may be because it chose to focus on marketing. In the promotional video, Ms. Dolphin stated that they, and I quote, underestimated the role marketing can play in the dietary shift, end quote. And when they changed the description of the meals to focus on the sauces and the herbs rather than the meatless meatballs, there was a higher uptake by consumers. And it's not just Sweden or the United Kingdom that is experimenting with consumer behavior modification. The first national restaurant chain in the United States to introduce climate ratings or counters on menu items was Panera Bread. They partnered with the World Resources Institute to calculate the climate impact of menu items called cool food meals. Their target was to have 60% of meals chosen fall under the cool food meals category, and they achieved this in 2022-2023, which is highlighted here under their commitments on their annual report. Now, it would seem that menu emission labels are being trialed in different places to see what works. And large organizations or institutions are being convinced to gradually alter food choices to reduce the amount of meat and dairy available. Notably, Sodexo and some major cities like New York are introducing these initiatives to children at schools and other places where it is the sole food provider. But you see, most governments aren't mandating this shift, although some are. And it's the choice of the food providers. Even with the changes happening in the United States to push back against some of this, there are cities in America, restaurant chains, and large corporations in other jurisdictions that are rolling this out. Now, watch out, you too might soon be seeing emissions labels on the menu at a restaurant near you. Thanks so much for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.